We've seen the historic composite picture of the first Black members of Congress: Revels, Turner, Delarge, Walls, Long, Rainey, and Elliott. But who were they? Hiram Rhodes Revels, 1827 to 1901, was born free in Fayetteville, North Carolina. His ancestors had been free since before the American Revolution. In Lincolnton, North Carolina, he learned the barbering trade from his older brother and later owned the shop. But he left to study theology in Indiana and Ohio. In Ohio, he was able to vote prior to the Civil War. During the Civil War, Revels helped organize 2 regiments of colored troops and served as a chaplain. Interesting, his second cousin, Lewis Sheridan Leary, was one of the men killed during John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Revels' ministry began as an African Methodist Episcopal Church AME minister, but he left to affiliate with the Methodist Episcopal Church and was assigned in 1866 to pastor a church in Natchez, Mississippi. In 1870, Revels was elected by a vote of 81 to 15 in the Mississippi legislature to finish the term of one of the state's 2 seats in the U.S. Senate, which had been left vacant since the Civil War. When Revels arrived in Washington, D.C., Southern Democrats in office opposed seating him. For 2 days of debate, the Senate galleries were packed with spectators at this historic event. The Democrats based their opposition on the 1857 Dred Scott decision by the United States Supreme Court, which ruled that people of African ancestors were not and could not be citizens. They argued that no Black man was a citizen. But the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. Supporters of Revels made arguments ranging from technical issues to foundational arguments about the why the Civil War was fought and won. They even used the race card, arguing that Revels was primarily European ancestry and Octoroon because of his mother's Scottish blood. They stated that the Dred Scott decision should be interpreted as applying only to those of total African ancestry. Supporters said that Revels had long been a citizen, voted in Ohio, and that he had met the 9-year requirement of citizenship before the Dred Scott decision changed the rules. On February 25, 1870, the party line vote of 48 to 8 favoring Republicans, Revels became the first Black American to be seated in the United States Senate. Everyone in the gallery stood to see him sworn in. Benjamin Sterling Turner, 1825 to 1894, was born a slave in Halifax, North Carolina, but taken to Alabama with his family when he was 5 years old. Unschooled, Turner studied secretly to gain a primary education. He was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Turner became a successful businessman, opening a livery stable in Selma, Alabama, reportedly worth $10,000 for the 1870 census. Freedmen were granted voting rights, and Turner turned to politics. He began as a councilman for the city of Selma in 1869. He was unanimously nominated to be the Republican candidate for Alabama's 1st congressional district and elected to the 42nd Congress. In Congress, he worked to restore political and legal rights to Confederates who had fought against the United States in the Civil War. He also fought for the repeal of the tax on cotton, on the grounds that it hurt poor Black Americans. He was not reelected. Robert Carlos Delarge. 1842 to 1874, was born in Aiken, South Carolina, to a mixed-race free woman and a Jewish father. They sent him to North Carolina for a primary education, and he graduated from Wood High School in Charleston. During the war, Delarge was employed by the Confederate Navy. At that time, he became involved in politics and was elected as a delegate to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention in 1868. That year, he was also elected as a Republican member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, serving one term until 1870, when he was elected State Land Commissioner. Delarge was elected to the United States House of Representatives later that year and served from 1871 to 1873. After leaving Congress, Delarge served as a local magistrate until his death. Joshua Thomas Walls, 1842 to 1905, was born into slavery in 1842 near Winchester, Virginia, and he never knew his parents. During the Civil War, he was forced to work without pay as a slave for the Confederate Army. He was captured by the Union Army in 1862 at Yorktown and volunteered with the United States Colored Troops in 1863. He rose to the rank of corporal, ending his military service in Florida. After the war, he turned to politics. In 1870, Walls was nominated as the Republican candidate for Florida at-large congressional seat after a contentious party convention. He won the general election to serve in the 42nd Congress. However, the vote was contested by the Democrat candidate. The House Committee on Elections unseated Walls after finding election irregularities. Walls ran for the at-large congressional seat again in 1872 and won. In office, Walls introduced bills to establish a national education fund and to aid pensioners and Seminole War veterans. In 1874, Walls ran for re-election to Congress in the newly redistricted 2nd District and won. But Democrat Jesse J. Finley, a former Confederate colonel, contested the results of the election. Finley was eventually declared the winner by the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives. Walls again sought the Republican nomination for the 2nd Congressional District in 1876. Black delegates were split between Walls and another black candidate, and the nomination went to a white carpetbagger. Walls instead ran for his old state Senate seat and served a 4-year term. He lost re-election in 1880. In 1873, Walls was admitted to the Florida bar and started a legal practice. He also served as mayor of Gainesville, Florida. Jefferson Franklin Long, 1836 to 1901, was born into slavery in Georgia. His father was white. He was illegally educated, taught to read and write. He was emancipated at the end of the Civil War and became a successful businessman, owning a tailoring shop in Macon. When a vacancy was created in the United States House, Long was elected as a Republican to the 41st Congress and served from January 16, 1871 to March 3, 1871. He was the second Black American sworn into the U.S. House of Representatives. He was the first Black congressman from Georgia. He was the only Black to represent Georgia until Andrew Young was elected in 1972. Long was also the first Black American representative to speak on the floor of the United States House, opposing the amnesty bill that exempted former Confederates serving in the House from swearing allegiance to the Constitution. Long served as a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 1880. During his brief tenure, he promoted several Reconstruction efforts. Joseph Hayne Rainey, 1832 to 1887, was born into slavery in Georgetown, South Carolina. He was of mixed race. His slave father was a successful barber who purchased his freedom and that of his wife and two sons in the 1840s. Rainey followed his father into the barber profession as an adult. In 1866, following the Civil War, Rainey's family settled in Charleston, South Carolina, where 43% of the city's population was Black. As a successful barber, he established himself as a community leader and became politically active in the Republican Party. In 1868, he was a delegate to the state constitutional convention. In 1870, Rainey was elected to the state Senate of South Carolina and elected chair of the Finance Committee. He served only a short time before winning a special election to fill a vacancy in the United States Congress. Rainey was elected December 12, 1870, and re-elected to Congress to serve 4 terms. This was a record for length of service for a Black congressman until the 1950s. Rainey supported the Enforcement Act, legislation to suppress violent acts by the Ku Klux Klan, White League, and Red Shirts. Rainey famously made 3 speeches on the floor of Congress in support of what was finally passed as the Civil Rights Act of 1875. In 1876, Rainey won re-election in his Charleston district, despite the Democratic candidate Richardson's claims that the election was invalid due to the intimidation of white Democrats by federal soldiers and Black militia guarding the polls. Rainey retained his seat. In 1876, elections were marked by widespread state voting fraud, where in Edgefield County, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate exceeded by 2,000 votes the total number of county registered voters. Similar results in counts in other counties brought Democratic control back to the state government. In 1877, when federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of the National Compromise to get Rutherford Hayes elected president, protections for Black civil rights ended and marked the end of Reconstruction. In mid-1878, Rainey warned President Hayes of increased violence against Blacks to limit voting in South Carolina, but little could be done since federal troops were no longer available. In 1878, Rainey was defeated in a second contest with Richardson. After leaving the U.S. Congress, Rainey was appointed as a federal agent of the United States Treasury Department for Internal Revenue in South Carolina. He held this position for 2 years, after which he began a career in private commerce. He worked as a brokerage banker in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. Robert Brown Elliott, 1842 to 1884, was born in Liverpool, England, to parents from the British West Indies. He studied law in England, graduated from Eton College in 1859. He joined the British Royal Navy and landed in Boston in 1867. He moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and was admitted to the South Carolina Bar in 1868. Elliott was elected and re-elected to the United States Congress. In 1871, before the body, he gave a notable speech on the bill to enforce the provisions of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It was known as the Ku Klux Bill. Later, he delivered a celebrated speech in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Elliott resigned from Congress in 1874, choosing to serve as sheriff to fight political corruption in the state. He again served in the South Carolina House of Representatives, where he was elected as Speaker of the House. His successes continued. Elliott won election as State Attorney General in 1876. South Carolina Democrats reclaimed political dominance of the state legislature that year, and Elliott was forced out of office in 1877 when the last federal troops were withdrawn from the state. In 1878, he formed a law practice but remained active in politics. After closing his law practice, Elliott was available to accept an appointment in 1879 as customs inspector for the Treasury Department of South Carolina. In 1880, Elliott was a delegate to the Republican National Convention, and in 1881, he was part of a black delegation that met with President James Garfield to protest the lack of civil and political rights in the South. I would be remiss excluding two gentlemen not pictured, but important political leaders, Blanche Bruce and George White. Blanche Kelso Bruce, 1841 to 1898, was born into slavery in Prince Edward County, Virginia, to a black servant mother and white father. He attended 2 years at Oberlin College in Ohio. He worked on a steamboat and started a school in Missouri for black children. In 1868, during the Reconstruction era, Bruce moved to Bolivar, Mississippi, where he purchased a Mississippi Delta plantation and became a wealthy landowner with several thousand acres of farmland. He was appointed to the position of Tallahatchie County Registrar of Voters and Tax Assessor before he won an election for sheriff of Bolivar County. He later was elected to other county positions, including tax collector and supervisor of education. He was elected to the Mississippi Senate in 1870 and served as sergeant at arms. In February 1874, Bruce was elected to the United States Senate, the second black man to serve in that house, and was the first elected black American senator to serve a full term in the United States Senate. He represented Mississippi from 1875 to 1881. On February 14, 1879, he presided over the Senate, becoming the first black and only former slave to have done so. At the 1880 Republican National Convention in Chicago, Bruce became the first black American to win any votes for national office as a major party's nominee, winning 8 votes for Vice President of the United States. The presidential nominee that year was Ohio's James A. Garfield. Bruce served by appointment as the District of Columbia Recorder of Deeds from 1890 to 1893. His salary was $3,000 a year. He also served on the District of Columbia Board of Trustees of Public Schools from 1892 to 1895. Bruce was appointed the Registrar of the Treasury, and again a second time in 1897 by President William McKinley. His signature was on legal tender notes. George Henry White, 1852 to 1918, was born in Rosendale, North Carolina, his mother a slave and his father a free person of color of African and Scots-Irish ancestry. In 1874, we find White a student at Howard University, studying classical subjects to be certified as a teacher. White finished Howard in 1877 and returned to North Carolina, where he worked as a school principal in New Bern. He also studied law and was admitted to the North Carolina bar in 1879. In 1880, White ran as a Republican candidate from New Bern and was elected to a single term in the North Carolina House of Representatives. He helped pass a law creating 4 state normal schools for blacks in order to train more teachers. In 1884, White returned to politics, winning an election in the North Carolina Senate from Craven County. In 1886, he was elected solicitor and prosecuting attorney for the 2nd Judicial District, a post he held for 8 years until 1894. In 1896, he was elected to the United States Congress, representing the predominantly black 2nd District in Tarboro. He defeated the white Democrat incumbent, Frederick A. Woodard. White benefited because a Democratic populist fusionist candidate had drawn off votes from Woodard. In 1894, the legislature repealed some laws which Democrats had used to restrict Black voting. And the turnout in 1896 among Black voters was 85%. In 1898, White was re-elected in a three-way race, but he was the last of 5 Blacks elected and seated in Congress during the Jim Crow era of the later 19th century. After then, no Black was elected from the South until 1972, after federal civil rights legislation was passed in 1965 to enforce constitutional voting and civil rights for citizens. During his tenure, White worked for civil rights and consistently highlighted issues of justice with analysis of the economy, foreign policy, and colonization with the treatment of Blacks. He supported an effort for reduction legislation derived from the 14th Amendment to reduce apportionment of congressional delegations in proportion to the voting population that states were illegally disenfranchising. He challenged the House in 1899 and again after the 1900 census to proceed with reduction legislation. White used the power of his office to appoint several Black postmasters across his district, making patronage hires, as did other postmasters. Following the actions of North Carolina Democrats in 1899, who passed a suffrage amendment to the state constitution to disenfranchise Blacks, White chose not to seek a third term in the 1900 elections. He told the Chicago Tribune, "I cannot live in North Carolina and be a man and be treated as a man." He announced plans to leave his home state and start a law practice in Washington, D.C. at the end of his term. On January 20th, 1900, White introduced the first bill in Congress to make lynching a federal crime to be prosecuted by federal courts. It died in committee, opposed by Southern white Democrats. A month later, as the House was debating issues of territorial expansion internationally, White defended his bill by giving examples of crimes in the South. He said that conditions in the region had to provoke questions about national and international policy. He said, "Should not a nation be just to all her citizens, protect them alike in all their rights, on every foot of her soil? In a word, show herself capable of governing all within her domain before she undertakes to exercise sovereign authority over those of a foreign land, with foreign notions and habits not at all in harmony with our American system of government. Or, to be more explicit, should not charity first begin at home?" White delivered his final speech in the House on January 29, 1901. This is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress, but let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up some day and come again. These parting words are in behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised, and bleeding, but God-fearing people, faithful, industrious, loyal, rising people, full of potential force. After White left office, no other Black American served in Congress until 1929. No Black American was elected to Congress again from a former Confederate state until Barbara Jordan's election in 1972. No Black American was elected to Congress from North Carolina until 1992.